During the events of the First Black Crusade, Abaddon the Despoiler, the Lord of the Black Legion, and Sigismund, the first High Marshal of the Black Templars, engaged in a bitter duel to the death, a duel in which Abaddon would prove the victor. Now, considering that Sigismund is commonly regarded as being one of the greatest, if not the single greatest swordsman throughout the entire history of the Legione Astartes, a number of people are under the impression that the only reason that Abaddon was able to win this fight against Sigismund was simply due to Sigismund being old, feeble, and weak. But is that really the case? I mean, yes, Sigismund was indeed much older at this particular point in time when they met, considering that Sigismund was described as being well over 1,000 years old. But I'd argue that potentially made him far more dangerous than he would have been in his prime. And the reason for this is due to the fact that because he was 1,000 years older and was effectively on an eternal crusade for the Imperium, that would have given him centuries of additional combat experience over Abaddon, which would have made him a far deadlier opponent. I mean, training's all well and good for a combat situation, but like anything in life, training will only get you so far, and nothing will actually compare to actual experience. I like to equate Sigismund at this particular point in time with Barristan Selmy from Game of Thrones, an older knight, an elderly knight for all intents and purposes, who, despite his advanced age, was still a complete and utter badass. Someone who, despite his age, would still be able to kick the shit out of anyone put in front of him. That was Sigismund during his fight with Abaddon. He was basically just, at that point, the 40k version of Barristan Selmy. Which is really cool, because Barristan Selmy is a badass, like I've already said, but anyway. And Sigismund was by no means weak during this fight. I mean, even Iskandar Khaon, who actually observed the fight, albeit through the eyes of someone else, he actually was genuinely surprised with how strong Sigismund appeared to be. Despite his age and apparent frailty, the way he moved, the way he carried himself, his poise, his combat stance, everything like that, in addition to the dozens of Black Legion corpses at his feet, he was by no means weak at this point in his life. He was older, yes. He was slower, yes. But he was not weak whatsoever. And in regards to him being slower, in terms of speed, his speed was comparable to, well, it wasn't even comparable, it was actually on par with Abaddon in his Terminator armor. Abaddon in his Terminator armor and Sigismund in his old age were described as being about as fast as each other, which put them on a pretty much level playing field. Abaddon had the advantage of the protection of his Terminator plate, while Sigismund had the advantage of reach with his Black Blade, or Black Sword, or whatever you want to call it, I forget the name off the top of my head. Now, while this does at first put them on an equal playing field, technically Abaddon was actually at a disadvantage during this fight. And the reason for this was due to the presence of the Talon of Horus, because, according to the novel Black Legion, the Talon of Horus actually affected Abaddon's balance, which actually put Sigismund at an advantage. So again, while Sigismund was by no means in his physical prime, his experience and the fact they were considered to be on par in terms of speed, it meant the fight was effectively equal. Now, I know a lot of people like to write off Abaddon as Abaddon the Failure or Abaddon the Armless or whatever you want to call him, because of the memes. What you need to remember about Abaddon is that he was no pushover in a fight. I mean, you don't get to be the first captain of the Sons of Horus and the leader of the Justaerin and a member of the Mournival for being a pushover. He was good in a fight. He's still good in a fight. He managed to take out a Custodes for God's sake. That's no easy feat. And yes, while Sigismund was indeed the better warrior in his prime, Abaddon was right up there with him. Abaddon and Sigismund, they had a bunch of people up there pretty much on their level. Guys like Raldoron of the Blood Angels, Eidolon of the Emperor's Children, Khan of the World Eaters, Sevatar of the Night Lords. There was a whole bunch of people who were almost as good as Sigismund and, probably only a tier lower than Sigismund. If Sigismund was S tier, then Abaddon, at the very least, was an A tier, at least. Plus, there's also the fact that, Sigismund managed to actually impale Abaddon with the Black Blade, or Black Sword. I'm just going to call it a Black Blade for sake of convenience, just because it's easier than trying to switch between all these names, but I digress. Anyway, the Black Blade, Sigismund was able to impale Abaddon in the chest, destroy several of his organs, whilst Abaddon was wearing Terminator armor. That's no easy thing to do regardless of what type of weapon you use. And even though Sigismund was by no means in his prime, like I've mentioned countless times by now, I am sure, this video is unscripted, I am rambling, I'll admit, but my point is, he wasn't weak and he certainly wasn't feeble, like some people like to suggest. Oh, and also, to the people who said that no, Abaddon didn't win, it was actually a draw, let me put this to you. If two people engage in a fight to the death, and one person dies and the other one doesn't, the person who lives is, by definition of a fight to the death, the winner. Get over it, essentially. And even then, the fight was certainly not a draw purely on the basis that, while Abaddon was indeed impaled, Sigismund was literally torn in half. There ain't no coming back from that unless he's being shoved into a dreadnought. Which, now that I think about it, that would actually be a really cool idea for a theory video. You know, what if Sigismund, was interred within a dreadnought after his fight with Abaddon? You know, Dreadnought Sigismund. You gotta admit, that's a pretty cool idea. Not gonna lie, but I digress. But, again, like, Sigismund was about 1,000 years old during his fight with Abaddon, and there have been a number of Space Marines who lived longer than Sigismund and were also by no means weak. I think the most recent example that comes to mind is Commander Dante of the Blood Angels. The guy's over 1,500 years old, and he single-handedly took down a Swarm Lord. That's not an easy feat. I mean, yes, he did technically die and was later resuscitated, but my point still stands. He took down a Swarm Lord. That's something more powerful than a typical Space Marine. I'm sorry. But Dante may not be the fairest example to compare Sigismund to, considering that the Blood Angels are often stated to have far longer lifespans than the average Space Marine. Okay, you know what? Fair enough. But what about Maximus Thane? Now, Maximus Thane became the chapter master of the Imperial Fists during the events of the War of the Beast, a conflict that took place about 1,500 years after the events of the Horus Heresy, which Maximus Thane did himself take part in, like he was at the Siege of Terra. He was probably a little younger than Sigismund during the siege, but again, he lived all the way to the War of the Beast, which took place 1,500 years after the Heresy. He was far older than Sigismund during the War of the Beast, and not only this, but he also survived the events of the beheading. You know, when 400 Imperial Fists ended up fighting 100 Aversa assassins, and Maximus Thane was like the only Imperial Fist who survived. 400 Fists to 100 Aversa assassins. That means the Aversa assassins had like a kill rate of 4 to 1, pretty much. And Aversas, like, despite not being Space Marines, they are incredibly powerful foes. They are incredibly powerful combatants, like, and incredibly dangerous foes. Like, their task is to take out guys like Chaos Lords or Orc War Bosses, you know, that kind of thing. And the fact that Maximus Thane, like, survived a battle against 100 of the fuckers, you know, despite having like 399 other Imperial Fists backing him up, that's still impressive. You have to admit, that's impressive. Again, I'm probably just rambling now, but the long and short of it is, Sigismund, despite being older, despite being slower, he was not weaker. And the fact of the matter is, his at least 7 centuries of additional combat experience would have made him a far more dangerous opponent then than during the Siege of Terra, in my opinion, purely for that additional combat experience. Oh, and also, before anyone asks, I know some people have said, oh, well, Abaddon only won because he had Draknien. No, he didn't. This fight took place before Abaddon got Draknien, so let's nip that in the bud right now, shall we? So yeah, long story short, Abaddon beats Sigismund, deal with it. Essentially. But anyway, leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time, this has been Remleiz from 40k Theories, and we'll see you again soon. Bye bye!